What is happening, guys? I am back this week for the third episode of This Week in Bodybuilding. This is the post-Olympia episode, kind of. We had an immediate post-show episode last week, but this is kind of the follow-up in the aftermath, the week after. So, not the busiest week when it comes to news in the bodybuilding world, but we do have some things to touch on that I didn't touch on in the last episode from last week, immediately after the Olympia, and some new stuff that has come up since then. So, first off, let's just touch on something that is pretty much relevant to the Olympia. We found out pretty much right after the Olympia that it was going to happen. Sebum, who is now retired, will be putting up some of his own money for Classic next year. And let me see if I can find the post here. Yeah, oh, wrong one. Sorry, Ramon. Right here. So Chris is going to be putting up some money. Obviously, it's an undisclosed sum, but knowing Chris, it's probably going to be a pretty hefty prize, and it'll probably look really, really cool and enticing for a lot of the Classic guys. I really think this is something that's needed from the IFBB in general. Obviously, I know Chris isn't directly affiliated with them, but I think it's an increase to the prize money in Classic is something that we've needed for a while. It just hasn't made sense to do it to this point because prior to now, increasing the prize money basically just meant that you were going to cut Chris a bigger check. And we all know he doesn't need it. Sorry, Chris. Now, with Chris retiring, obviously it's awesome that he's throwing in his money, but I would like to see the IFBB maybe just, even if they just upped it 50 grand, you know, they brought up the total 100 grand and then whatever Chris throws in on top of that, that would be really cool to see because now I think it's going to be much more of an attention draw in Classic because a lot of people learned to love Classic because of Chris. And now without Chris being in the picture and competing, it's going to leave the door open for a lot of fans to really find someone new to latch onto in Classic, and it makes the division more interesting. A lot of people who are fans of Classic already are now looking for the next person. They're really interested in seeing what happens, but also a lot of people who are not necessarily super invested in Classic, like myself, and you know, I'm more invested in Open. Those people will be interested in watching Classic and just cranking up the numbers on the Classic views because we're curious to see who's going to come next after Chris. Will it be Mike? Will it be Urs? Will it be Ramon? Can Wesley make up ground that he lost this year? Who knows? And it could be someone else entirely. The thing you have to remember with Classic is that field is so deep. There are so many good high-level competitors in Classic that it's really anybody's game. If people come in, you know, 1-2 years from now, highly improved, which in Classic, you know, that can be a pretty significant jump over that period of time, they could run away with it. Or, you know, we might see kind of what we're seeing now in the Open, where we have this back and forth between 2, 3, 4 guys, and we have for the past 3, 4, 5 years. Regardless, it makes it much more interesting. So it's awesome to see that Chris is throwing in some money. I hope the IFBB will up the prize money a little bit there too, because again, I do think it is the division that probably needs it most in terms of viewership to athlete payout ratio. You could argue there are other divisions that probably need a bump, like some of the women's divisions as well. But at the end of the day, those divisions aren't selling tickets and they're not selling stream views. And if the money's not there, they can't expect a higher price. So that is what it is. But Classic, again, next year, I think it'll be a much bigger draw than it has already been. And it's already probably the second largest category or division to watch outside of Open. So I think it'll be cool. Hopefully the IFBB also agrees with that and ups the money a bit. Now, getting away from the Classic physique division for a little while, we are looking at your current Mr. Olympia, Samson. And Samson has already announced he plans to do the Arnold Classic in 2025. So I'm really interested to see who else does it. To follow up on this, Hadi has already said he is not doing the Arnold. So it will be really interesting over the next week, 2, 3, you know, just the coming weeks and months in general before those shows arrive to see who announces that they're doing it. Not just the Arnold, but some of the other big shows as well. I mean, we have the Pittsburgh Pro now offering $100,000 to the first place winner. That's Dubai Pro money. That's an awesome prize. So I think we're probably going to have a lot of competitors obviously focused on those two shows. But as far as the Arnold's concerned, I think it's most likely going to be Samson and Martin are the two to watch to do it, because I think Martin might do the Arnold. I don't know if he has confirmed that he will or will not yet. I don't know if he's talked about any shows. If he doesn't do the Arnold, I would put money on him doing Pittsburgh. One of the two. I don't think he'll do both. I don't recall what the timing for Pittsburgh Pro is, but I think it would be a little tough to do both if memory serves me correctly. Now, I think the wild card, or rather the person who we are waiting on announcement from more than anything as far as what shows they might be doing, I think that's going to be Derek. Okay. I think everybody is going to be interested seeing that Derek fell from Mr. O to third to see what his plan is for the next year. Is he just going to take time to improve and then hit the O again? Or is he maybe going to hop into a show and be like, hey, I'm still here. Shut the fuck up. Quit talking shit. Because a lot of people are. And I'm interested to see what he does with that. I would think he's probably just going to focus on improvements for the O, and he's not going to focus on doing any other show. But we'll just have to see. We know that Samson's doing it. And then, as I said, we also know that Hadi has confirmed. I don't know if he has confirmed, but it's been made public that he is not doing the Arnold. And this is interesting, actually. I'm not necessarily surprised by this, but I'm very interested to see how Hadi comes in at next year's Olympia, purely based off the fact that Samson is going to be doing the Arnold and Hadi is not. He's taking the time. Whereas this past year, Hadi and Samson both did the Arnold US, and I believe they both did the UK as well. Unless I'm forgetting, and maybe Samson didn't do the UK. But regardless, someone can remind me down below who did what. I know Hadi did both because I believe he won both. So it will be interesting with him out of the picture to see who wants to try and challenge Samson. And honestly, I don't think that Samson is going to be challenged by anybody at the Arnold, but I think it will be a really interesting show for the sake of being able to see comparisons between whoever decides to do it and Samson. You know, if let's say Rafa does it and Martin, let's say he does it. Let's say maybe even Derek does it too. You might have a top three where you have Samson, Martin, and Derek, and Martin gets some time to just hang out on stage right next to Samson and Derek. And that would be really cool to see because that brings him into an interesting perspective where we see him now compared to who his probably two or three biggest rivals are going to be in the 2025 Olympia. So it's not necessarily that I think Martin could win the Arnold. It's possible, but I don't think he's beating Samson. But it's more so that he gets the opportunity to compare himself directly to Samson or Derek or whoever else may do the Arnold. Again, we'll just have to see. But once we find out, it will be really interesting to see who's going to do it. Like I said, I would bet that Martin is going to do the Arnold or the Pit Pro. I don't think he's going to do both, but it'll be interesting to see which one he decides to do. Now, before we move on to the next kind of question I want to pose, it's not necessarily a story, but it's another interesting point. I want to touch on the video overview of the pose by pose breakdown that Tyler put out. I believe it was just yesterday that this video came out. And man, it was a really good breakdown. I love watching these videos from Tyler breaking down all of the judging and what they're looking at because they also use Gilco videos. So it's phenomenal quality footage that we get to see with the mindset of the judge and the guy breaking it down right in front of us. So if you haven't watched it, go watch that. I believe it's on the NPC News Online YouTube page. Definitely worth the watch. But a brief breakdown of that is that Samson beat Hadi 5-3. So it wasn't a crazy sweep. He didn't blow him out of the water. We kind of all thought that. But I want to see what you guys think about this. Let me know. Let's go through some of the actual pose by pose here. If you look at the front double, Hadi versus Samson, they gave this to Samson. I think I would probably agree. The only thing that draws my attention more on Hadi in this pose is the bicep. I think it just looks more visually appealing than Samson's. but Samson has improved his arms a lot, and this pose is a good pose for him. He has definitely improved this pose quite a bit. So I think it's really good. I think it could go either way, but as we see, they picked Samson. Front lat spread. They say in the video, Tyler says rather, that this is Hadi's weakest pose. While I think it's his weakest pose, they said that Samson's was noticeably better. I don't necessarily see that. I mean, I think here in the picture, you know, he's obviously not fully set into this, but I think I actually would have given this one to Hadi. They gave it to Samson, so that puts Samson up 2-0. Side chest, normally I would give it to Hadi, but Tyler made a good point in the video. Yes, Hadi's conditioning, and this was something I noted last week, was not as on point as it usually is. He didn't come in Hadi condition, okay? It wasn't a bad look. I'm not saying he came in, you know, really shitty or off, but it definitely is not something, it's not as good as the Arnold Classic was this year. Let me put it that way. And that kind of goes back to my point I was trying to make before of, without Hadi doing the Arnold, is he just going to do the O and be completely fresh? Because if he is, that's going to be interesting to see, especially since Samson is still doing the Arnold. Now, Samson beat him this year, and Samson also did the Arnold this year, and France Pro as well. So it's possible that it doesn't make a huge difference, but I think it will allow Hadi to be a little more fresh and be just a little bit sharper on stage, which honestly this year, that's all he was really missing. Now, looking at the back double. This, again, another pose I would typically give to Hadi, but his conditioning was not as good this year. It throws it off. I agree with this. I think it should go to Samson. Back, well, this should be back lat. They said back double. Back lat spread. Yeah, this is, Hadi's just a smoke show in this pose. Even if his conditioning's not 100% on point, Hadi blows anybody out of the water in this, in my opinion. I personally think that Hadi's back lat spread is better than Derek's. And people will argue that Derek's is the best in the IFBB. I really think that Hadi's is better. Personal opinion, personal preference. Side tricep, I fully agree with giving this to Hadi. I think that the way Samson hits it is just not very befitting of his physique. I think he could, if he improves this pose, I think Samson could actually blow Hadi out of the water here, but visually, I think Hadi takes this. Ab and thigh, I don't even need to talk about this one. This is Hadi's every single day of the week. This is, there's no conversation here. The most muscular, this is probably the most controversial score of the comparison here. Giving the most muscular to Samson is, I think this is a decision that was based purely on structure and not actually based on the muscularity and the display of the muscularity in the pose. I know Tyler breaks it down a little bit differently, but I think that Hadi in a most muscular is just, I mean, fucking look at that. His conditioning wasn't even the best it's ever been, and this is just insane. This looks wild, just from every angle, head to toe. Like, there's nothing that doesn't look crazy about this pose on Hadi. Whereas on Samson, you could argue that the midsection's not that great. The shoulders could be a little bit better. His chest, also, I will say, this is not what, at least in Tyler's view, was the way that Samson hit this. It was a hands clasped, I believe, most muscular that Samson hit, and he did look better in that. But if we're going off this shot, then I would give this to Hadi every day of the week. So if it were me judging this, I think I would have had Hadi winning because I had him ahead in the most muscular, which would have brought it up to 4-4 based on their scoring. And I also had him ahead in the, I believe it was the front lat. So that would have made it 5-3, Hadi to Samson. Just my opinion. I think Samson still deserved the win, but if we're going pose by pose, then I guess personally I would have scored Hadi higher just looking at the pose by pose breakdown. But we also have to understand, you know, people see these pose by pose breakdowns, and obviously it's a very good thing that Tyler is putting these out. But this isn't necessarily exactly how a show is scored. It's not necessarily scored pose by pose. There's more to it than that. So you have to keep that in mind as well when you're looking at just a pose by pose breakdown and judging. It's just overall about the package they bring that night too. And Samson brought his best, Hadi brought less than his best. So you have to take that for what it's worth and kind of factor that in as well. And I think they did a good job of breaking down where they could and then being obviously, you trust the judge's judgment in this case. And I think they did a great job. I think they made the right call. Samson absolutely deserved this. Hadi absolutely deserved second. And I mean, you could have argued that he deserved first. You could still argue that. If Samson would have got second, I don't think I would have complained. But I think this was a great, great show. And I think these guys both got exactly what they deserved out of this show. Something I want to touch on, and I think this is going to be a bit of a touchy subject. Nick Walker. I don't know if I've really put my opinion out there on him dropping out, but I will say I think it's a terrible look. I think it sets a bad precedent in the entire IFBB, and just for the sake of, hey, if I'm not ready, I'm just going to drop the fuck out. It's like you signed a contract, you should be on that stage, even if you're going to look like shit. Sorry. You shouldn't be able to protect your placing or your perceived placing just because you say you have an issue. Obviously, if there's issues that aren't publicly available, like they don't want to make things public, maybe it's a mental health issue, maybe there are actual health issues and they're just kind of trying to cover that up for Matt's sake, then, you could, I guess if that was communicated internally to the organizers and the promoters, then sure, you could say that that's more of a valid reason. But if that was the case, just come out and say it. I think pussyfooting around and playing this game of, oh, it's just, I'm just not there, having your coach do this video for you. I don't know whose decision that was. It could have been Matt's, but it's just this whole situation is weird and really reflects poorly on Nick. That being said, I don't have anything against Nick, but it's getting to the point where it's getting harder and harder to stay on his side and to like him. Last year, sure, totally understandable pulling out with an injury like he had. Makes sense. But then that pretty okay, that poor showing at New York Pro, not a good look. And then pulling out of this show, the Olympia of all shows, just because you're not ready, that's really bad. And I hope that in the aftermath of this situation, one, I hope that Nick is genuinely okay. I no ill will to the guy, regardless of how I think the situation leaves a bitter taste in my mouth. It's not because of Nick. I think he's a great bodybuilder. I hope the best for him, and hopefully everything's good. But that being said, I think that the IFBB, in light of this kind of a situation, they need to implement punishments. They need to implement penalties for missing contractual obligations, because you're not contractually obligated to do a whole lot in the IFBB. But if you get one contract in the Olympia and then you blow it, you should absolutely be punished for that. There should be some sort of repercussions for that. Now, I'm not saying, freaking take the guy out to the gallows and hang him. I'm just saying there needs to be some sort of a system in place where it's like, if you don't do the show, you can't do it the next year. Sorry, you have a 1 year hiatus you have to take. You can compete in pro shows, you can do whatever else, but you cannot compete in the Olympia even if you qualify through a pro show or other means. I think that's valid too. Let's say you have someone who's a former Mr. Olympia. They say they're going to do the show. Let's just hypothetically use Nick. If he was a former Mr. Olympia and he said, I'm not ready, I'm not going to do the show. Okay, you can't do it next year. And then the year after, you have to requalify. We're stripping you of your grandfathered qualification for being a Mr. Olympia. I think that's perfectly fair. Now, that doesn't apply in this situation because Nick's not a former Mr. Olympia. And honestly, at this rate, I don't know if we'll ever see him claim that title. I wasn't sure of it before, to be honest, but yeah, I think that the whole situation kind of sucks. But the reason I'm even bringing this up is that I think it'll be interesting to see if Nick ends up doing the Arnold. I think doing the Arnold, it depends on what's going on. in his life and with him, and if he is healthy. If he is, and he opts to do the Arnold, I think it will be incredibly interesting. In fact, I want nothing more than to see Nick do the Arnold because of two things. Two people, rather. Samson and Martin. Now, the caveat to this is that we aren't sure if Martin's going to do the Arnold, right? We just don't know. But if he does do the Arnold, then that means Samson and Martin are at the Arnold. If Samson and Martin both do the Arnold, that would give Nick the chance to stand next to arguably two of his biggest competitors. Because I think a lot of people in this show, in this year's Olympia, if Nick had competed, I think they would have put Martin ahead of Nick, honestly. And it was very close between Martin and Nick at the New York Pro. So truthfully, there's a bit of a rivalry building there in my mind. But then seeing Nick compared to Samson, I mean, Samson and Nick at the Arnold is just another awesome one to see. So it will be interesting to see if he does opt to do the Arnold. My fingers are crossed. Even if Martin doesn't do it, Nick and Samson being compared would be very, very interesting to see, because now we have a guy who hasn't done the last two Olympias and has had a pretty poor showing in between them compared to the current Mr. Olympia. And if Nick really shows up at the Arnold, again, provided that he does it, it could really change a lot of people's perceptions of him that have been marred a bit by this whole controversy with him dropping out of the Olympia the second time. So I think that if he shows up good, has a good showing at the Arnold, it will only look good for him. Now, if he shows up at the Arnold really badly, it's not going to be pretty. And I feel like that's not going to, that at that point, I would think there's probably going to be a coaching change if that were to happen. But now we're getting into the realm of these far off hypotheticals. Obviously, Nick has not said what show he's doing, if any, what's going on. There's no real update from him on that. But like I said, personally, I would love to see Nick, Samson, and Martin compared at the Arnold. That would be awesome in my mind. Maybe Derek slips in there too, who knows? I would love to see it. I know a lot of other people would love to see it. And I think it would make for a very, very, very interesting set of predictions going into the 2025 Olympia. I know we're only 1 week past the 2024 Olympia, but man, it's already getting to the point where we have to start thinking about what next year looks like. I mean, we're getting to show announcements from people. We're starting to see what is going to happen over the next year and who might qualify, and it is exciting. It's one of the things I love about bodybuilding. That's one of the things I love about bodybuilding and why I do this, is that it changes show to show. I mean, fuck, it changes picture to picture on Instagram. You see a guy looking off on Instagram, you're like, oh man, he's going to lose the show. My predictions, like, it's fun. So very interested to see what happens with Nick, if anything, to see what he does next year. Obviously, very interested in seeing who else announces some upcoming shows and what might happen there. But that is going to be it for this week in bodybuilding, guys. This is the third episode. I will be back next week with episode number 4, and hopefully we'll get some more announcements and maybe some interesting new news. Now, before we go, I want you guys to tell me down below where you think the best version of Nick Walker would have placed in this year's Olympia lineup if he had done the show. Personally, I think he could have pulled off maybe third, and then it would be a battle for fourth between Martin and Derek, which I personally think Martin would have won. So I think Derek could have even slipped to fifth. If Nick had done the show in his best shape, he could have come in third. But let me know what you guys think. It would be very interesting to have seen that, but obviously we know how that goes. Anyways, guys, until next time and next week, take it easy.